HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Fierce Ambition, The Life and Legend of War Correspondent Maggie Higgins, by Jennet Conant, read by E.J. Lavery. I wouldn't be here if there were no trouble. Trouble is news, and gathering it is my job. Marguerite Higgins. Prologue. We did all kinds of crazy things that I never would have done by myself. But, you don't want to be shown up by a beautiful young lady. Peter First, Stars and Stripes correspondent. On Sunday, April 29, 1945, Marguerite Higgins was at the 3rd Infantry Division command post outside Augsburg in southern Germany, trying to figure out a way to get to Dachau. Less than 20 miles of unsecured road separated her from the infamous concentration camp, which was about to be freed by American forces. Maggie intended to be there when the tanks rolled in. A 24-year-old unknown cub reporter with the New York Herald Tribune, she had teamed up a few weeks earlier with Sergeant Peter First, a combat-seasoned correspondent with the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes. First's chief attraction was that he was in the possession of a jeep, which meant he could take her where she wanted to go without some military minder ordering her to the rear. Hitchhiking a ride with a young soldier reporter, she had covered the 3rd as it tore through Bavaria in pursuit of the fleeing enemy, capturing the Nazi citadel at Nuremberg after a furious house-to-house siege, followed by the astonishing bloodless capitulation of Augsburg. The latter was orchestrated in part by First, who had called ahead to the Burgermeister and warned him that resistance was futile. When a German emissary later brought word that the Burgermeister, with the help of the local anti-Nazi underground, was prepared to hand over the city to the Americans, Augsburg fell without a fight on April 28. Delighted at the outcome, the two correspondents congratulated themselves for their part in such thrilling wartime exploits as taking cities by telephone. Early the next morning, Maggie, all smiles, had tried to persuade the commander of the 3rd Division, Major General John Wilson, Iron Mike O'Daniel, to fly her to Dachau in a spotter plane. She might as well have asked for the moon. A tough-talking soldier of the old school, he told her bluntly that it was a good way to get killed. What was left of the Wehrmacht, the armed forces of Nazi Germany, was in their sector. The 15th Corps, the 7th Army's major tactical unit, was moving south with the mission of taking Munich, and it had 3 of its infantry divisions, the 45th, the 42nd, and the 3rd, in line. O'Daniel's orders were to push to Munich, where the enemy might be preparing to make a last desperate stand. The other 2 infantry divisions were targeted to pass through the Dachau area, but the concentration camp was not his military objective. Undeterred, Maggie put the proposition to First. Let's drive to Dachau. He looked at her and decided. It was worth the risk. Many of the neighboring villages were draped with white flags. In the prevailing mood of surrender, he thought the odds were pretty good that they could make it across the enemy-held territory in one piece. The tricky part was that no one seemed to know the exact location of the camp, just that it was in or near the town. But First could see Maggie was ready and eager, and he did not want to let her down. Then the driver of a half-truck armored vehicle, who had overheard them discussing their plans, offered to lead the way ahead of the troops. They set off immediately, racing ahead of the 42nd, Rainbow, and 45th, Thunderbird, divisions, hoping to be the first reporters on the scene. The liberation of Dachau would be front-page news. For Maggie, it would also be a huge scoop, a chance to break the biggest story of her career in the waning days of the conflict. The Third Reich was almost finished. Hitler's soldiers were in headlong retreat. She was running out of war, and out of time. She had been tipped off that the Americans would be closing in on Dachau that day. But the military situation was fluid, and the rapid and confused advance, also spearheaded by 2 combat commands from the 20th Armored Division, encountered more resistance than expected. No one was more surprised than Maggie to discover that a battle for a neighboring village was not yet over. And instead of converging on the camp with their triumphant troops, she and First were staging an ad hoc liberation operation of their own. While Dachau was no great distance on the map, it turned out to be an interminable white-knuckle drive. Maggie felt very exposed in their open jeep with stars and stripes stenciled in large letters on the front, a fluttering American flag on the side, announcing their allegiance. She held her breath as they rolled past group after group of heavily armed Wehrmacht soldiers, bearing rifles, pistols, and grenades. The bedraggled infantrymen seemed to know the war was all but over, and willingly offered up their guns, piling them in the back of the jeep until it was full. Even after the soldiers were disarmed, Maggie's sense of danger did not abate. She had not been in the field long enough to feel comfortable around so many weapons. Dressed in a bulky German army jacket and fatigues to disguise the fact that she was a woman, her blonde curls tucked into a fur-lined hat with ear flaps, she was less afraid of being shot than that one of the grenades rattling around the back of the vehicle would explode. When they reached the quaint, cobblestone town of Dachau, they stopped to reconnoiter. They could hear the sound of artillery fire in the north, where at least one of the American divisions was still engaged. The local townspeople were friendly, however, and some even cheered them on. The civilians they questioned told them that white flags had been spotted flying from buildings on the southern edge of the camp. Encouraged, they decided to head in that direction. A quick end run around the fighting, and they would be there. While passing through town, they encountered 5 U.S. Army jeeps belonging to Brigadier General Henning Linden, the stocky 53-year-old assistant commander of the 42nd Division, and his men. Linden had orders to take a small reconnaissance group and secure the concentration camp. His instructions were to keep the inmates contained and frozen in place until medical help arrived and the necessary relief supplies could be brought in by support columns. With his party was a 6th jeep bearing 2 Belgian journalists, accompanied by 2 former French prisoners of war, who knew how to get to Dachau and offered to serve as guides. Maggie and First joined the caravan and fell in behind the lead jeep, where Linden's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant William Cowling, acted as scout. With the assistance of the French POWs, they had no difficulty finding their way. By the time they approached the outer edge of the camp that afternoon, the tanks of the 45th Division had already arrived at the western end and were moving in. As the sprawling Dachau complex came into view, Maggie could see it included dozens of administrative and factory buildings, barracks, officer quarters, and training grounds. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the barbed wire enclosure where the prisoners were kept. It was the most segregated and secure part of the camp, a separate walled-off compound ringed by guard towers, electrified fencing, and along the western side, a canal that functioned as a moat. Unlike Linden and his men, Maggie had some idea of what lay ahead. At the time, most American soldiers knew almost nothing about the concentration camps, beyond the rumors of terrible conditions and mistreatment. Rumors many, including Maggie herself, had tended to discount as exaggerated wartime propaganda about the enemy. But as one of the first reporters inside Buchenwald, which she had toured shortly after it was liberated on April 11, she had seen firsthand that all the tales about the Nazis' extreme brutality were true. Her story about the unimaginable horror at Buchenwald had helped to reveal to the world the reality of the concentration camps, as a cold-blooded operation designed to degrade, torture, and exterminate untold thousands of inmates. Now, she was intent on being the reporter who broke the news of the Nazi atrocities at Dachau as well. From what she and First had gathered at headquarters, it was going to be grim. One of the oldest concentration camps in Germany, Dachau was established in 1933 to hold upwards of 5,000 political prisoners who had voiced opposition to Adolf Hitler's regime. But the numbers had quickly swelled as the Nazis began rounding up Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, as well as ever-increasing numbers of foreign nationals from occupied territories, so that the inmate population soon far exceeded the camp's maximum capacity. With Germany on the brink of collapse, the conditions in the camp had steadily deteriorated, with the situation becoming desperate in recent months. There were rumors that the food and water had run out some days ago, and the prisoners, who had staged a revolt, were trying to hang on until help arrived. Maggie steeled herself for the depths of human misery they would encounter. As they drew nearer, she was hit by the smell. It was the gut-churning stench of decay. Outside the perimeter of the Dachau complex, on a railroad siding that led into the camp, was a long stationary train consisting of some 40 boxcars. Dead bodies spilled out of the open doors and gondola cars. Men, women, and children had been packed in like cattle and left to die of hunger, thirst, and disease in the locked carriages. The grotesque cadavers, with their distorted features, bony arms, and legs protruding at odd angles from ragged blue and gray-striped prison uniforms, told of the agony of their final journey. Alongside the tracks, there were mounds of corpses, the rotting remains of those who had been hauled out and shot. They had been piled in heaps, waiting to be carted away and buried, or burned in the crematorium. Trash, excrement, and scraps of clothing littered the ground. Sickened by the sight, she bent double and wrenched. General Linden gave the order to press on. They turned right and drove up the wide avenue that led to the arched main entrance of Dachau, topped by a large wreathed swastika and imposing stone eagle. They made their way deeper into the camp, where they encountered a small reception party. Waving a makeshift flag of truce, a white sheet tied to a broomstick, was the acting commandant of the camp, Lieutenant Heinrich Wicker, accompanied by his aide and by a Swiss civilian, Victor Maurer, a member of the International Red Cross. Wicker, a strapping young officer who was smartly attired in his helmet and uniform, saluted with a Heil Hitler, clicked his heels, and stated that he was ready to turn over the camp and all of its prisoners. His stiff, formal demeanor and arrogant expression so outraged Maggie that she slapped him. First offered to act as interpreter. Born and raised in Germany, he had fled with his family after the Nazi regime began its persecution of Jews and later emigrated to the U.S. As the American soldiers and reporters gathered around the acting commandant in a semicircle, Wicker explained that he had been put in charge only the previous day, and that most of the garrison, members of the SS, or Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite guard, had absconded. Only a small contingent remained behind, about 50 soldiers, to man the machine gun placements in the guard towers. First told Wicker that General Linden would accept the official surrender of the camp on behalf of the American Army. While the terms were being negotiated, First asked the acting commandant to assign someone to take him and his colleague directly to the inmate enclosure. Maggie, hovering on the periphery, was close enough to hear the conversation, but not so close as to attract notice. She knew that First, wary of the high-voltage fencing, had requested an escort as a precaution because he had no intention of trying to open the prison gates himself. Just then, they heard the sputter of a machine gun coming from somewhere on their left flank. Everyone dove for cover. First thought that they were being fired on by the SS guards. As soon as the shooting stopped, he and Maggie took off in a hurry in their jeep, with Cowling and one of his MPs perched on the hood. A German prisoner served as their escort. Everything happened so fast that no one agrees on exactly what took place next. And over the decades, it has been the subject of varyingly self-serving accounts from all involved. According to Maggie and First, A group of SS guards suddenly appeared beneath one of the concrete watchtowers. Looking up, the reporters saw that the observation platform was crammed with more sentries, rifles at the ready. There was no point in trying to run. With a show of false bravado, Maggie called out to them in German, "Kommen Sie hier!" Come here. They obediently came toward us, she recalled, hands in the air. Then another group of a dozen or more guards descended from the tower. A total of 20 SS guards approached and forfeited their weapons. Cowling had the men remanded into custody. The lieutenant and the two journalists then got back in the jeep, and with their German escort in tow, they crossed a small concrete bridge over the canal that bordered the enclosure. Directly in their path, a man lay dead, a bullet through his head. The German prisoner dismounted and shoved the body aside. They proceeded straight to the two-story Jurhaus, or entrance building, that served as the main guard post of the compound, and without delay went through the heavy wrought iron gate, emblazoned with the Nazi slogan, Arbeit macht frei. There was not a soul in the yard when the gate opened, Maggie wrote in the Herald Tribune. But the minute the two of us entered, a jangled barrage of, "Are you Americans?" in about 16 languages came from the barracks 200 yards from the gate. An affirmative nod caused pandemonium. Tattered, emaciated men, weeping, yelling, and shouting, "Long live America," swept toward the gate in a mob. Those who could not walk limped or crawled. In the wild outpouring of joy that followed, the prisoners sprinted toward her, running, falling, tripping, getting up, and rushing forward again. One flung his arms around her in an enthusiastic embrace that lifted her off her feet. Another enveloped first in a huge bear hug. The ecstatic inmates picked up their liberators and tossed them in the air, hoisting them from shoulder to shoulder and parading them around the camp, too excited to detect a soprano voice of protest rising above their raucous cheers. The atmosphere of hysteria produced unbelievable strength in men who looked too weak to stand, and Maggie was quickly overwhelmed by the welcoming stampede. One man, who had his arms around her neck and was kissing her effusively, heard her cry out that she could not breathe. He hastily disengaged and fended off the others. Mon Dieu, c'est une femme, he exclaimed in French. Pardon, madame. A Catholic priest and a deputy of August Cardinal Hlond, primate of Poland, he was deeply chagrined by his mistake. Once Maggie had wriggled out of the priest's embrace, off came the goggles and helmet. Golden locks fell down and a pert, made-up face was revealed, recalled Nirin Gun, a Turkish reporter who was one of the internees in the yard. The officer was a woman, a war correspondent, Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune. After half an hour of being tossed around by the delirious throng, the rattled and badly bruised reporters were relieved to see the American soldiers at the gate. When General Linden spotted Maggie in a crush of prisoners, all of them clamoring to tell her their name and nationality, he bellowed, "What the hell are you doing in there? Don't you know the place is raging with typhus? Come here." There were 33,000 half-starved, lice-infested, traumatized prisoners incarcerated at Dachau, many ill with typhoid. The barracks were filled with the sick and dying. Linden had to keep the POWs locked up until the medics arrived. If the prisoners got out and spread the epidemic throughout the countryside, it would be a disaster. Inside the compound, tensions were running high. The prisoners were working themselves into a fever pitch at the prospect of their imminent liberation. A crowd by the fence was on the verge of rioting after being told they could not leave because of the quarantine edict. When Maggie approached the gate, Linden reached through the grillwork and grabbed her by the collar, shaking her hard in an effort to knock some sense into her. At that moment, a sea of inmates surged forward, flattening her against the gate and winding her for several seconds until she managed to extricate herself with the help of Cowling, who had entered the yard ahead of her. "God damn it to hell!" she swore, her initial astonishment giving way to anger as she twisted loose. Finding her voice, she shouted at Lyndon at the top of her lungs, giving vent to all the pent-up fear and anguish of the past few hours. "Lay off! Let go of me! I've had my typhus shots. I'm in here doing my job." She went back to work, determined to interview as many of the prisoners as she could. She had been told that some of the greatest brains of Europe had spent more than 11 years interred at Dachau. She was not going to leave until she learned the fate of several important political and religious hostages. Léon Blum, the last premier of France, Kurt von Schuschnigg, the former Chancellor of Austria, Prince Leopold of Prussia, and Martin Niemöller, a prominent anti-Nazi Lutheran pastor. If they were found alive and rescued, it would make headlines around the globe. Recognizing that the situation was fraught with danger, Lyndon directed his men to remove the reporters and to restore order in the enclosure area, which was now filled with thousands of shoving, screaming prisoners. Hundreds had climbed onto the roofs of the barracks. Some were frantically trying to break out via the Jurhaus building, and the windows and doors had been burst open, and people poured through. By now, soldiers of the 45th Division, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks' 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment, had reached the Jurhaus gate. Sparks' task force, which also had orders to secure the camp, had been busy clearing buildings and capturing small clusters of German troops. The shots the reporters had assumed were fired by the SS probably came from Sparks' platoon, which had fought its way from the other side of the Dachau complex. The shots could also have come from the coal yard, where several of Sparks' men, enraged by what they had seen at the death train, opened fire on a large group of captured SS guards, killing at least 17 and wounding as many as 75. By the time Sparks got control of his men and made his way to the Jurhaus gate, the prisoners had worked themselves into a frenzy. In response to the growing violence in the compound, Sparks ordered his men to fire their weapons in the air to quell the bedlam. Over the next hour, soldiers of the 42nd and 45th managed to push all the prisoners back inside the enclosure, seal it off, and install their own armed guards. Once the crowd had quieted down, Lyndon agreed to allow the journalists to see the rest of the camp. Even as darkness fell and First urged that it was time to go, Maggie kept on reporting. She kept searching for the special prisoners until an inmate told her they had been evacuated days earlier. When at last she and First departed, it was late, and the roads were clogged by convoys. At midnight, when the RCA transmitter shut down, they were still miles away from the press center. She had cut it too close and missed her deadline. It would be another 16 hours before she could file again. She spent the night dozing fitfully by the side of the Autobahn, cursing the stubbornness that had resulted in a rookie error. However, the next morning, instead of heading straight back to the press center, she could not resist taking a slight detour to Munich, less than 10 miles away, to watch the fabled Bavarian city, where Hitler rose to power, fall to the 7th Army. The Herald Tribune ran 2 front-page stories, datelined April 29, delayed, and April 30, both carrying Marguerite Higgins' byline. The stories, written in a hurry, did neither event justice. Still, her stark eyewitness account of the liberation of Dachau was the exclusive of a lifetime, and it made her a star overnight. The other journalists who were there that day also wrote personal stories for their respective publications, but none was as dramatic as Maggie's. She had cast herself as a prime player in one of the most momentous episodes of the war, relegating to the accompanying soldiers and their nameless officers only minor walk-on roles, ensuring her own place in history. First's vivid portrayal of her jubilant reception at Dachau was the stuff of legend. In his dispatch for the Stars and Stripes, he described how Higgins, a pretty, blonde war correspondent, was the first person to announce to the inmates that they were free. She shouted the glad tidings in German, French, and English to the prisoners, who were crowded around her with tears streaming down their worn and bearded faces. He wrote that the men, most little more than walking skeletons, fell to their knees in gratitude, grasping her hands and kissing the dusty ground at her feet in one of the maddest and most heart-rending liberation scenes of the war. A few days later, First learned he was being called back to the Rome bureau. He and Maggie went their separate ways. Their journalistic partnership and road romance were short-lived, but, emboldened by his fearless approach, a brand of courage she adopted as her own, Maggie had succeeded in establishing her reputation as a nervy and relentless reporter who, as her editor put it, covered the news with a single-mindedness and determination that brooked no interference. In only 8 weeks at the front, she had reeled off an amazing string of page-one stories and made her byline known to the newspaper's hundreds of thousands of readers in Europe and the U.S. The Tribune would take to trumpeting the daring exploits of their girl correspondent behind enemy lines, establishing a practice that, for better or worse, would become a hallmark of her career. From then on, the mere fact of Maggie's presence in the combat zone would be almost as newsworthy as the events she covered. To cap it all off, she and First were awarded campaign ribbons for outstanding service with the armed forces under difficult conditions. Maggie later learned the recommendation was made by her erstwhile foe, General Lyndon. During the worst chaos at the camp, when several prisoners flung themselves against the fence in an attempt to get out and were instantly electrocuted, she rose to the occasion and helped to alert the inmates to the danger. Taking over the loudspeaker system, she warned of the lethal current and urged calm until First and another officer found someone to flip the master switch and cut the power. Within 24 hours of Dachau's liberation, Hitler was dead. A little more than a week later, the war in Europe was over. On May 8, the night of Germany's total surrender, Maggie attended a victory party at a magnificent castle near Salzburg, where Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, had once hosted important guests. Schloss Kleisheim was now the palatial headquarters of the 3rd Division, and O'Daniel had invited all his regimental and battalion commanders, plus the half-dozen correspondents who had been covering them, to celebrate the end of the war. At exactly 1 minute after midnight, they all went out on the balcony and watched as the artillery guns fired into the black sky. For nearly half an hour, red and blue flares and tracer bullets flashed in a patriotic display, and the percussive guns echoed across the valley, while the surrounding mountains roared and shook with the noise. High above in the Obersalzberg, outside the remote village of Berchtesgaden, with its toy-like houses, was the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's beloved alpine retreat. And far above, clinging to a rocky outcrop, was the famous Eagle's Nest, his spectacular mountain eyrie, said to be a 50th birthday present from his inner circle. Days earlier, O'Daniel had superseded his orders and sent the 7th Infantry Regiment to capture Berchtesgaden, so that his men would have the honor of taking the Nazi prize. An hour before the Americans arrived, Hitler's SS bodyguards had set fire to the Berghof. All that was left, Maggie wrote, was a gaunt, blazing ruin, The day after they took the Nazi stronghold, she toured the smoldering remains of Hitler's once lavish home, with its cavernous living room and grand marble staircase, now
Sample complete. Ready to continue?